Well, I should tell you a little bit about this paper. The last time that I presented it was several years ago. Yes, I've been working on it that long. It was at Berkeley in front of a bunch of academics, and when I opened the presentation up thinking about what I would say here today, I realized that I had to make a lot of changes so that hopefully I could do some of the things that people said on, what was the website again? RateMyProfessor.com, yes, and actually make this stuff sensible to the average person. And I'm not sure that I've done a good job of it, but we'll see. And I mentioned the length of time I've been working on the paper. The paper actually started at the University of Redlands when I was working with a student who was doing an honors thesis, of all things. And it was an honors thesis that I thought was just fantastic. I asked her if she was interested in continuing work on the idea, and we did. She later went on to USC into the master's program in public policy and slowly worked on the paper, got it grilled by many other economists, and finally got it published just now in January 2011. So that's the paper, and I originally thought, well, what can I talk about here at Scripps? Of those papers that India mentioned, which one? Well, the reason I decided on this one really has to do with the picture that's on your lower left there. Can anybody tell me who that is? Yes?
Is it Frances Perkins?
It is Frances Perkins. Okay, so you can't answer this next question. Who is Frances Perkins? The reason I thought this would be very appropriate for Scripps College is because this is the first woman ever selected for a president's cabinet position. She was appointed by FDR to be the Secretary of Labor. And not only that, not only is she the first woman to hold a cabinet position, but she's also the individual to hold a cabinet position the longest. She held that position from 1933 to 1945. Okay. Well, so the story that I'm going to tell today really begins with Frances Perkins in 1933 and FDR and the New Deal reforms. And one of the many New Deal reforms was the signing of the National Industrial Recovery Act. What was this National Industrial Recovery Act? What it was basically an act that called for a minimum wage. In addition to calling for a minimum wage, there were other labor provisions in the act as well. It called for restrictions on hours. It called for restrictions on child labor. Okay, and it also called for some things called fair trade codes. Now, the fair trade codes are ultimately what end up in the overturning of this act, actually. What ends up happening is that one of these fair trade codes stipulates the conditions under which chickens can be slaughtered. Well, one of these big slaughter companies brings the case to the Supreme Court, and all 9 Supreme Court justices decide that this is an unconstitutional delegation of government power to private interests. The decision later becomes known as the sick chicken decision. Okay? The problem with the sick chicken decision is that not only does it overturn these fair trade codes, but it also overturns all the progressive labor policies that are in the National Industrial Recovery Act. So gone are the minimum wages, gone are the child labor restrictions, gone are the hours restrictions, all of it. Okay? So in 1936, the government comes back with the Public Contracts Act. Now, this was a much more limited law because what it stipulated was that government contractors had to pay a prevailing wage, which was going to be determined by the Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. It had hours restrictions, child restrictions, and all of this as well, but it was for government contractors. It was not for all employers. Well, what we see during this period is that the Supreme Court, from time to time, would be hearing cases from individual states who were trying to take into their own hands this idea of imposing a minimum wage. And every time this came to the Supreme Court would overturn the minimum wage. Say, no, you can't do this. Well, finally, in 1937, the Supreme Court upholds the minimum wage law that's passed in the state of Washington. So FDR says to Francis Perkins, now's the time. Now's the time to go and pass sweeping labor legislation. And that's what occurs in 1938 with the passing of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act actually called for a 40-cent minimum wage. The result, after all of the debates in Congress, and of course you guys are all familiar with this stuff, it ends up being something like 25 cents an hour as a starting minimum wage. It imposes a 40-hour work week. It imposes restrictions on child labor. Hence the pictures. Okay, and we get what we know today. Now, since the passing of the Fair Labor Standards Act, we've seen amendments to the Act about 11 times. Most of these amendments have had to do with two things. One is increasing the rules for coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So now more workers are covered than were when it was originally passed. And the other piece of the amendment has to do with increasing in the minimum wage, which we've seen from time to time. Okay, our study goes from 1984, uses data from 1984 to 2000. Okay, so you can see that you have several federal minimum wage increases during that period on the graph. Now, what we have on this graph are both what are called nominal minimum wages and real minimum wages. The real minimum wages are simply adjusted for inflation. I use $1997. So there's nothing special about the crossing point other than I use 1997 as the base year. So what we've seen is that the increases initially in the minimum wage, if you look at the blue line, those increases in the minimum wage were enough to not only keep up, but in general, be larger than increases in inflation or increases in the cost of living. So what we see from the point in time in which the Fair Labor Standards Act is passed up until about the 1960s are essentially increases in the real value of the minimum wage. Then in the 1970s, we have this huge inflationary period, and even though there were increases in the minimum wage in the 1970s, those increases were not large enough to keep up with inflation during this period, and we see a fall in the real value of the minimum wage. In the 1980s, during the Reagan era, we see one of the periods in which minimum wages remain constant for one of the longest periods, and we see at the same time inflation gradually eroding away the value of that minimum wage. Okay, we see another period like this, by the way, in the 2000s, a long period in which minimum wages don't change and inflation is slowly eroding away the value of that minimum wage. But even with some of the significant increases that we've had recently to the minimum wage, it is now at $7.25 an hour. Okay, it has been increased every year for the last few years. It started at $5.15 there in this last spike, and now at $7.25. But even still, the real value of the minimum wage has not reached what it was in the late 60s, early 70s. Okay, it's still, in terms of real value, lags behind that time period. However, there's also variation in minimum wages across states. It's not just national variation, and this is a table showing some of that variation that exists across states, at least during the time period for which we have data. And the way this works is basically if a state has a minimum wage that exceeds the federal, employers must abide by that minimum wage. Otherwise, they must abide by the federal minimum wage. Okay? Now, this is not a whole lot of variation, but I'm going to come back to this because we have another way of inducing or looking at how binding such a minimum wage might be. So, for example, you might imagine that there would be two states that have the same minimum wage, but the effect of that minimum wage may not be the same in those two states, because you may have one state where there are a lot of workers earning at or near that minimum wage, and in another state with the same exact value for the minimum wage where far fewer workers are working near that minimum wage, and most of them are earning much more than that. So I'm going to come back to this point because it turns out to be relevant for our findings. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more specifically about this research. As far as we know, we're the first to look at the effect of minimum wages on unemployment duration. Now, most of you who know a little bit about economics know that economists, despite all their rigor, they like simple stories, and they like testable hypotheses. They like to say, well, if you observe this, then the result or the prediction is that, and we should be able to get some data and test that prediction. And the challenge here is that the link between minimum wages and unemployment duration is not so clean. It doesn't lend itself to necessarily a nice testable hypothesis, because the duration, unlike, for example, employment levels, economists like to say, well, if minimum wage goes up, this is very clearly what's going to happen. More individuals will like to work, so there'll be more supply of labor, but it'll be more costly to hire those workers, so firms will cut back on the number of workers that they hire, so there will be more unemployment. Simple story. Okay? But the duration, how long individuals spend in a state of unemployment, is a completely different matter. Because this is going to depend very much on the churning that occurs in the labor market. Okay, so you might have, for example, an influence on labor force participation rates and an influence on turnover rates within the firm that influence how long individuals stay unemployed. Okay, to make it simple, let's say an increase in minimum wage makes minimum wage jobs more valuable to those who hold them. So you might imagine if an individual's minimum wage all of a sudden increases, they will now work harder to keep that job. And if they work harder to keep that job, that could reduce turnover. The reduction in the turnover, however, can actually increase the length of time that those who are unemployed remain in that state. Okay? On the other hand, an argument that is sometimes made is that increases in the minimum wage undermine the matching process that occurs in the labor market. That is to say that you have firms who are offering different wages because they expect different skill levels at those jobs to perform those tasks. But if you increase the minimum wage, you now condense that wage distribution, and now everybody's making $7 an hour. Now, how do I differentiate between somebody who should be doing a job task that's worth $5 an hour, $6 an hour, $7 an hour? Everybody wants to earn $7. Everybody has to earn $7 an hour. So now how do I differentiate these tasks? I get mismatching in the labor market. This mismatching causes turnover because employers find, well, this person isn't as good as I thought they were going to be, and so we let them go, and now we go back to the pool, search for another worker. What does that do? Well, it might reduce the duration of unemployment. So what I'm trying to say, basically, is that there is no single predictable hypothesis when it comes to unemployment duration in terms of how it's going to be affected by an increase in the minimum wage. Most times economists don't like this sort of thing, and so they tend to avoid these kinds of questions. We said, nah, we're not going to do that. It's interesting. It has policy implications. Why? Why is it important to focus on unemployment duration? Well, for one thing, unemployment duration terminates the accumulation of human capital of work experience. And not only that, it can lead to the deterioration of that human capital. So the skills that individuals once had become obsolete the longer they remain in the state of unemployment. Okay? And we believe that there are minimum wage policy implications for this, regardless of what the displacement effects are. As I'm going to mention in just a second, there have been debates about the extent to which increases in the minimum wage cause displacement. And what we're saying is, well, regardless of what side of that debate you fall on, there are still implications if there are effects on unemployment duration, because there are clearly these other negative human capital effects from longer unemployment spells. Okay, so let me spend a couple of minutes talking about the literature on minimum wage. I'm going to say very little about this. Okay, let me say this. In 1978, there was a survey of economists. There was a statement given to them. It said, minimum wages cause displacement for younger and lower skilled workers. And then they were asked to agree or disagree with the statement. 90% in 1978, 90% of economists agreed with this statement. In the year 2000, economists from the same association, the American Economics Association, were given the same statement and asked the same question. And only 46% agreed with the statement that higher minimum wages cause displacement for younger and lower skilled workers. Now, why? What happened in between? Well, what happened in between was all this research on minimum wages, okay, that I'm not going to get into the details of. But essentially what you see here are two camps. If you were an economist, you basically fell into what one would call the Card-and-Kruger camp. Most of their studies find that increases in the minimum wage lead to no displacement whatsoever. Or you were in the Newmark and Washer camp. Most of their studies, like I said, I'm not going to get into the details why, but most of their studies find that when minimum wage goes up, there's displacement. Workers lose jobs. But even in their studies, the amount of displacement was so small that many economists started doubting whether there was this textbook relationship between higher minimum wages and overall employment levels. Okay, and then since then there have been studies into the effect of minimum wages in other areas like turnover, labor force participation, on the job training. I'm not going to get into those. So for our paper, we use something called duration model. And I'm not going to get into why it's complicated, why we use the duration model, but let's just say that the duration, the amount of time that we see people spending in a state of unemployment tends not to have a normal distribution, and that means we have to use some other techniques to estimate this. We break the impact down into some different groups. We look at the impact on males and females, and within males and females, we look at three groups. We look at young versus older. Okay, the cutoff is age 25, as is typical in the minimum wage literature. We look at higher skilled versus lower skilled, and that break is determined on the occupation. Okay, and then we look at high school graduates versus high school dropouts. Okay, and for the data, we use something called the Displaced Worker Survey. The Displaced Worker Survey is a supplement to the Current Population Survey. For those of you who don't know, the Current Population Survey is what the United States actually uses for its official unemployment rate statistics. Okay, this was a supplement that was conducted every 2 years with the Current Population Survey, and it looked specifically at displaced workers, those who were unemployed. What's nice about it is that we have a lot of individual level information on these workers: their age, their gender, their race, sex, where they live, all sorts of family background information. We know also their pre and post displacement information. We focus on those aged 18 to 64, and here's just a snapshot of the data. I'm speeding up a little bit because I'm worried of running out of time. Here's a snapshot of the data. Again, there were more groups than this. Okay, so I'm just giving you the high school graduates versus the high school dropouts. And one of the things that we see here is that unemployment duration is significantly longer for females in comparison to males. It is significantly longer for dropouts in comparison to high school graduates. Okay. We also see some huge differences in, and by the way, there are many more control variables. This is just a subset of the control variables. There are significant differences in health insurance. Close to 40% of the high school graduates who are displaced have health insurance. This health insurance could come, for example, from a working spouse. But if you look at the high school dropouts, the rates of health insurance are much lower. The reason why we control for this is because the idea is that if an individual loses their health insurance, they're going to search much harder for a job, so you want to control for that when you look at the impact on duration. And the same thing with unemployment insurance. There are differences there, although the differences are far less pronounced than they are with the health insurance. Okay. So what are the effects? Now you'll notice on the vertical axis it says the word survival. That may seem a bit strange, and the reason that I mentioned that we use a duration model. These same exact models are actually used in the medical field, and they call them survival models. And the reason is because they usually say, okay, look, here we have this person, we're going to give this treatment, that treatment. Now, how long does it take for them to die? And they call economics the dismal science. So this is the same idea. The only difference is this is not death. What's being measured here is whether or not you're still in a state of unemployment rather than a state of life. And so, in other words, the way to read this is you have the percentages along the vertical axis, the percent of individuals who are still in a state of unemployment. Okay, so coming out here to the number of weeks, you can see that the percent, there are very few who actually spend 150 weeks in the state of unemployment among these displaced workers. The overwhelming majority of them, okay, go back to work fairly quickly. Okay, so what we did is, after estimating this duration model, we simulated the impact of different minimum wages on that unemployment length, on that duration. Now, for this group, the male high school graduates, what we actually find is that when we increase the minimum wage from $3.35 to $4.25 and then to $5.15, okay, the length of time that is spent in unemployment actually decreases. Okay, so in other words, if you were to just pick any spot here, if you take this 0.4, okay, the length of time spent in the state of unemployment is a lot shorter as the minimum wage goes up. Okay, or if you go vertically, you can say, okay, what about 50 weeks? Then you can say, well, what is the probability? What is the probability that somebody would still be unemployed at 50 weeks? So, well, that depends on what the minimum wage is. The higher the minimum wage, the lower is the probability that the individual would still be unemployed. Now, this is just one group. These are the male high school graduates. Okay, but what happens when we look at the high school dropouts? Completely different story. Okay, for the high school dropouts, an increase in the minimum wage actually it increases the duration, the unemployment duration, significantly. Okay, almost doubled as we went from 335 to 515. Okay, so they might spend a much longer period of time in the state of unemployment. And then we look at the females. Same thing. Problem. Because we expected that we might see something similar with the female high school graduates as we did with the male high school graduates. But we don't. We actually see that for them as well. When the minimum wage goes up, the unemployment duration also increases. Okay? No, I like this strangely. It's exactly. We were thinking this is weird. And to make matters even worse for the females, okay, when we look at the high school dropouts, even larger effects. Okay, so minimum wage goes up, much longer periods of unemployment duration. Okay. So I didn't show you the other groups, but for the males, the picture that we saw of the high school graduates was not unique. We saw the same sort of pattern with the older group of males, and also those that were classified with higher skilled occupations. Okay, minimum wages went up, unemployment duration went down. Okay, but we saw longer unemployment duration for particularly male high school dropouts and basically all females. Now, I should say that they were not all largely significant. Okay, they were all negative. We didn't see anything positive like we saw with the male high school graduates. Okay, everything was negative in the sense that they were spending longer periods of time in a state of unemployment when the minimum wage went up. Okay, so then we thought, well, why? What could possibly explain what we see here? Okay, so one of the issues here is that now you have, employers are having to increase their wage for the low skilled jobs. That's essentially what's happening when the minimum wage goes up. Now, one of the reactions you might expect from employers is that when this occurs, they're going to be more diligent with their screening practices, right? They're going to say, look, now you're going to force me to pay $2 more per hour for a worker doing a low-skilled job than I was paying before, then I'm going to try to get a worker that's even more productive. I'm going to pay more attention to these low-skilled workers. Now, what we think is happening here is some form of labor substitution. That is to say that you have workers that are probably still lower skilled, but there's some differentiation. So you may have a high school graduate who doesn't have a lot of skill, but is still more skillful than somebody who is a high school dropout. The reaction of the firm is to substitute some of the lowest skilled workers with workers who are of slightly higher skill. And so you get some workers who benefit from this, but who loses the ones who are on the lowest tier of skill and ability. Okay, and as far as policy goes, we think this is actually something that's very alarming, and we need to pay very close attention to this, because what's happening is that the minimum wage now has serious distributional issues to think about. Like I had said before, most of the evidence that looked at displacement effects has been finding very small, no matter what side of the camp that you're on. Is no effect, negative effect. Even the negative effects have been very, very small. What we're saying is, well, regardless of what's going on in the aggregate, with those aggregate employment effects, we have to pay very close attention to this distributional effect, because the idea here is, the idea behind the minimum wage is that it's supposed to help those skilled workers, that it is supposed to help those at the bottom, bring them up. Okay, and what we're finding is that, in fact, what the minimum wage might be doing is actually hurting precisely those workers who are the intended beneficiaries of the policy. And if that's what's going on, we need to perhaps rethink public policy so that it's not so one-dimensional. That's not to say that the low-skilled workers don't need a helping hand. Perhaps they do, but perhaps minimum wage is not the best way to lend that helping hand. Job training programs and other things that increase human capital and productivity might be more effective and have a smaller negative distributional impact than what we're currently seeing with the minimum wage. So I think I'll stop here, and I believe that leaves some time for questions or concerns or things that I may have said too quickly. So, floor is open.